Christianity as a natural religion. Bruce Charlton. Christianity is nearly always described as a religion of revelation. In other words, it needs to be revealed to us, we need to be told about it, told by, for example, written scripture, handing on by tradition, teachings of church authorities, etc. The contrast is a natural religion that could be reached by each person for himself, by intuition, reasoning, observation, etc., based on suggestions from the material that can be found in pretty much any human culture. The paganism of animistic hunter-gatherers is regarded as an example of natural religion, since it seems to have arisen spontaneously, albeit with local variations, all over the world. When I became a Christian, it was partly by accepting the need for revelation, and by evaluating the strength of validity in various contending revelations, that I got out from trying to reach Christianity by my own unaided efforts. There is no real doubt that mainstream Christianity, in whatever of its denominations or churches, is way too complex to be arrived at except by revelation, but the big question is whether the necessary and sufficient essence is, in principle, attainable without external help. And, if not accessible during this mortal life, then potentially core Christianity might be accessible after this mortal life, i.e. after death, but before making the choice to accept or reject resurrection. Over the years I have come around to the idea that Christianity is, or can be, a natural religion, and does not require revelation. Indeed, what has traditionally been regarded as revelation may more often be an obstacle than assistance nowadays, especially since the churches are so corrupted by worldliness, corrupted to the point of value inversion, and their teachings so vast and, to common sense, incoherent or contradictory. I think it is largely uncontroversial that theism, specifically the belief in a personal creator God, can be a natural belief. That this world was made, and with some design and purpose, and by a being who is like a person, is a plausible line of reasoning that often occurs to children. And the further idea that this God relates to each of us like a loving parent, is also one that can occur to anyone who thinks about the subject, by analogy with the human family. In short, all the necessary background to Christianity can be arrived at without being taught, and, because it is true, potentially confirmed by intuitive conviction. As for Christianity, I think the core idea is also simple enough, and close enough to the desires of the human heart, that it could be arrived at by almost anyone. The fear of death and desire for everlasting life is spontaneous, and that this continued life would be embodied is also natural, and that this life after life would be in a better world without death or decay are all plausible daydreams, even for a child. So the necessary materials, for a Christian yearning are there. As for the mechanism by which this might be achieved, which is by following Jesus Christ, as a sheep follows the Good Shepherd, this is not something that is likely to be a natural or spontaneous conclusion. Therefore, natural religion breaks down at the point where we need to know how to attain resurrected life eternal. But, since this following of Jesus through death to life everlasting happens after our death, it seems reasonable to assume that it is something made clear to us after death. No matter what a person's experience during mortal life, he could be shown the possibility of resurrection after his death and how to attain it. Therefore, whether he was born before Jesus' time or lived in a part of the world where Christianity was unknown, or had been taught or reasoned out some false idea of Christianity, every soul could be given the knowledge of what he need to do to follow Jesus. Thus, Christianity can be a natural religion. And this fact may turn out to be vital to salvation, as the corruption of the churches continues to spread and advance. Explaining demonic spirits and the damned souls, as the consequence of choices related to love, mortal incarnate life/entropy/death, and resurrection. Bruce Charlton. We must die in order to be remade, to be resurrected. This is salvation. Damnation is the other choice, to reject salvation. We must be resurrected to enter that state called heaven, because for heaven to be heavenly, all within it must have been remade, wholly good, without disposition to evil. Or, to enter heaven, we must make a permanent commitment to repent and repudiate all sin, all evil, all that opposes divine harmony, and the way that this permanent commitment is made is by resurrection, in which all that is good, God harmonious, in us is retained, while all that is not is left behind and discarded. Such a permanent commitment is made from love, and therefore must freely be chosen, cannot be compelled, and can only be made by those capable of love who choose to make love their eternal foundational principle. Only thus can heaven be a place that is wholly good, a place without any evil motivation, and also wholly free, inhabited by beings with divine powers of creation, who will always and spontaneously use their godly powers harmoniously with God and other heavenly beings. The need for death is true for men and women, and for all other beings. Which is why this incarnated mortal life on earth is dominated by entropy, because everything must die, if there is to be a possibility of resurrection. In other words, if every being on earth is to have a chance of attaining and choosing heaven, they all must die, sooner or later. Premortal spirit life, although wholly good, is very imperfect, especially in terms of freedom, of agency. The harmony and goodness of premortal life is dependent on the passivity and obedience of spirits, because premortal beings are not innately wholly good, in the way that God is wholly good, or resurrected beings are wholly good. Because premortal spirits are not wholly good, the harmony of goodness in premortal life is attained top-down, by the direction and control of God. In effect, so far as premortal spirit life goes, God is the wholly good parents of a mixed bunch of children, some mostly good, some mostly evil, none wholly good. It is only by the obedience of these children that goodness prevails. But premortal spirits mature, they grow up, they change. Sooner or later, they get to a point where they must throw off the passive goodness of obedience to parental authority and control. Then these premortal spirits have a choice. Either the spirits can incarnate on earth, sometime afterwards to die, and make the choice of resurrection, or not. This is God's plan, because God wishes to make and inhabit heaven with resurrected, incarnated everlasting beings, who have by their choice of resurrection made an eternal commitment to live in harmony with divine creation. Or else those premortal spirits who do not want to die and be resurrected, or who simply do not want to die, and those who reject the divine plan for an harmonious heaven of free beings who have chosen to be remade without evil. These spirits can escape their previous state of obedience to divine goodness, and enter the sphere of earth while still spirits, and therefore immortal. These are the demons. This explains why demons are spirits, not embodied, and why they are immortal. They are spirits because they have refused temporary mortal incarnation, and are immortal because they are spirits, and unaffected by entropy. If the premortal spirits choose mortal life on earth, they must choose temporary incarnation and death, as necessary prerequisites for resurrection, but if they reject this package, then such spirits have rejected even the possibility of heaven. This is why all demons are evil, and why demons are worse than incarnated men, because demons, by their rejection of mortal incarnation, have all chosen to reject the possibility of that death which makes salvation possible. If demons changed their minds and repented, and wished to prepare for the choice of heaven, they would need first to incarnate and die. Whether this is possible or ever actually happens I do not know. So, demons have rejected the passive, second-hand, good of premortal spirit life under the parental influence of God, and they have also rejected that mortal life on earth which is a necessary stage to prepare for remaking by resurrection, and heaven. The ruling principle of creation, that which makes creation cohere, is love, and love is the reason why the dead choose resurrection and heaven. The essential reason why demons have rejected mortal incarnation, and why some dead mortal men reject the offer of resurrection into heaven and instead choose damnation, is that demons and the damned are either incapable of love, or have rejected love as the basis of life and chosen something else. Differently phrased, demons are those never-incarnated beings who have rejected living under the domination of entropy, i.e. mortal earthly life, and by doing so rejected God's plan of salvation. The damned are those who chose to live and die as mortal incarnate men on earth, and have become discarnated beings, i.e. souls severed from their bodies, and who die and then reject resurrection and heaven, instead choosing some other fate. Note, why our final God-destined state of being is embodied, incarnate, rather than spirits, is a topic I have considered elsewhere. Anamnesis in relation to Jesus, is this a germ of truth in Gnosticism? Bruce Charlton. Anamnesis is a kind of unforgetting. In theology/philosophy it can mean a recollection of suppressed or blocked truth and reality, that is triggered by some kind of releasing stimulus. It was an aspect of Gnosticism, as with the hymn of the pearl, an allegory for this mortal life in which the son of a king is sent to earth to retrieve a pearl, but forgets his mission, among the temptations of life, until reminded of it by a letter. Supposedly, historically, this was not intended to mean Jesus, but maybe it did originally, to some extent. At any rate it fits my understanding that Jesus, having been incarnated specifically to bring resurrection to men, did not remember his mission, because, presumably, the time was not right, or the right trigger had not been arranged. Thus Jesus did not become divine, i.e. attain to his divine creative powers, until his baptism by John, when John recognized who Jesus was, and the Spirit of God provided signs to that effect. Gnosticism was mostly wrong, and wrong in several fundamental assumptions, but, of course, everything that catches on and affects the world has some truth in it, even when that is distorted, partial or inverted. Theosis and Salvation, the Reason and the Choice. Bruce Charlton. Salvation is a personal decision, the individual person's choice to follow Jesus to resurrected everlasting life. But the reason why such a choice is made is for the sake of others, because of what we want to do in the heavenly state of being. This doing entails love of others, including God, and fellow men, and becoming more divine, that is becoming fully aligned with God's creation and the sub-creation of our fellow resurrected men. The term for this becoming fully aligned with God's creative purposes is theosis. Thus, while salvation is individual, theosis is relational. Therefore, the reason for salvation is theosis. Male and female created he them. William Wildblood. The blurring of the lines between male and female, which has been going on for almost 200 years now, has several purposes behind it, but first let us be absolutely clear. It is a spiritual attack on the soul of humanity. Separating us from the reality of nature is the next step on after separating us from the reality of God, and this is one of the best ways to do it because the division between man and woman is fundamental. When you attack nature in this way, you attack God who created nature, and you attack him in a more radical way than simply by not believing in him. That in the conditions of the modern world is often a passive thing, but this is active because it deforms and denies the obvious and the everyday. God is not immediately apparent to human beings as they are in this world. The difference between man and woman is. Then there is the matter of making us believe lies. We all instinctively know the reality of the two sexes. It is hardwired into us. By making us doubt this reality, by denying it and enforcing that denial through public policy as we do, we acquiesce in a lie, and when we accept a lie against what should be our better judgment, we have lost our freedom. We become slaves, capitulating to power, which is what slavery is. When you believe a lie while inwardly knowing that it is a lie, you have handed over your individual integrity to an outside authority, and the only authority that you should be doing this to is God. If you do it to anyone or anything else, you are making that thing God. To make people believe palpable nonsense is to control them completely. Next, this deconstruction of the sexes emasculates men and defeminizes women. Everyone loses. Some feeble men might feel safer and more comfortable in such an environment because their weaknesses are pandered to and even portrayed as strengths. Similarly, some power-crazed harpies might thrive, or think they do, but again this is because their vices now become virtues in the inverted scale of values that have come about. In fact, what is happening is that sins and failings are rebranded as positive things and encouraged. The spiritual state of such people is dire. They succumb to their faults and there is nothing to bring them back to truth and goodness. The reasons offered for destroying the boundaries between man and woman are inevitably to do with right-sounding values such as fairness, justice, compassion, etc. However, none of these can ever be used as a justification for going against truth. You cannot use secondary values, which they are, to overthrow primary ones, and there is nothing more primary than truth. And to what is the fairness, to what the compassion? The spiritual man or woman or the earthly one? Reinforcing the fallen earthly man or woman against their spiritual selves is neither just nor compassionate. It is, in fact, quite the reverse, because it solidifies them in their fallen state. Jesus did not tell sinners they were fine as they were. He told them to abandon sin and follow him. If the demons who are behind this attack on the male/female divide, aided and abetted by their servants, witting and unwitting, in this world, succeed in their aim of destroying masculinity and femininity, they will have brought about a situation in which reality is what we want it to be, and that means there is no reality. Human beings as they will have become then might have a fake therapeutic spirituality, but they can have no proper spiritual understanding if they reject nature. They will have effectively separated themselves completely from God. This will not be allowed to happen universally, though it may well happen to many individuals. I do see signs of the younger generation, those born in this millennium, beginning to reject the stupidity of their immediate forebears and start to reassert the reality of male and female. I hope this gathers pace. But we have fallen so far, it has a long way to go, and it may be that only collapse and suffering will bring us back to our senses. It is indeed the character-sapping comforts of the modern world that have brought about the possibility of this lunacy in the first place. In a less artificial environment it would never have taken off. God created divisions and boundaries for reasons of knowledge and for reasons of love. It is difference that enables understanding. In an amorphous oneness there is no higher or lower, no better nor worse, no greater nor lesser, and therefore nothing can be known. And if a man can become a woman or a woman a man, what then of love, which, in this sense, is the completing of one soul by the other? Of course there can be love between people of the same sex. I am not speaking of homosexuality, but this is not the same as the love between a man and a woman, which is profoundly creative as it reflects the union of God and nature. To seek to destroy the differences between the sexes attacks the root of our being and can only come from something that has so separated itself from God that it has no authentic self. For at the bottom of this being is not goodness, truth and life, but a void, and that is where it seeks to take us. Sex, believe it or not, is a holy thing. It is precisely because it is a holy thing that it can become a diabolical thing when corrupted. But in itself, and when correctly oriented, it is love, and it is creation. The devil hates it and seeks to despoil it in every way he can, either through excess or perversion, or else by gelding males and making females barren, which seems to be what is behind the latest developments. We must preserve it in its goodness and wholesomeness, and allow no deviation from its essential truth. Where are other worlds located? The mental block of modern consciousness. Bruce Charlton. I've changed my mind on this topic several times, over the course of this blog. It is an important issue, and one where I think we probably need a coherent answer to avoid spirituality being sabotaged by corrosive doubt. The general question has many specific versions. One is to ask where exactly heaven is located, especially considering that Christians believe in resurrection, so that the vagaries of spirits being everywhere, and nowhere, are denied us. Is heaven inhabited by the resurrected dead, walking around, up in the sky, outer space, a remote planet? All answers seem either evasive or absurd. Another version is the underworld, the Dwat, or the world after death, Sheol, Hades, the inner world, the collective unconscious, or collective consciousness. People talk as if these are locations, or domains, but where? Why can't we detect them? Then there is fairy, elfland, is that under a mound, in or through a forest, across the seas, or maybe on a different plane of existence through which we must travel? It is easy to reduce answers to absurdity, in a modern world where we assume we have explored the whole planet, and that scientific instruments allow us to detect anything that is real. I suggest here that, as so often when a question seems unanswerable, this is because we are asking the wrong question. We are assuming that the world is reality, and our knowing of that world is secondary, and optional, thing, an essentially passive matter of recognizing reality. In other words, we are assuming that our minds have no significant role in the existence of reality, except to fail to notice it or to distort it. We assume that real reality, Kant's Das Ding an sich, the thing in itself, is out there and solidly real, even when unthought, unperceived, unknown. Yet this almost universal habit of thinking about reality is incoherent, therefore wrong, as demonstrated by, amongst others, Rudolf Steiner and Owen Barfeld. Instead, a coherent understanding of reality must include the consciousness of the knower. Without the knowing consciousness of a being, there is only meaningless disorder, literal primordial chaos. This is not to say that consciousness simply makes up any reality it wants, a reality without any reference to anything out there, because there is nothing out there, e.a. philosophical idealism. It is instead to say there is no knowing, no knowable, without consciousness, so that consciousness and reality cannot be separated. We may notice that this question, where are other worlds, was not regarded as a problem in much of the past in human history. The answer seemed obvious, or else an answer was not requested or required. And the question was not a problem because people knew other worlds. People once perceived these other worlds for themselves, either on an everyday basis, or, later, in special states of consciousness induced by religious ritual, dreams, trances, or whatever. That which is perceived is not regarded as unanswerable. Therefore I conclude that the question is a product of changes in human consciousness. We ask where other worlds are located because modern man no longer spontaneously perceives other worlds, and has mostly lost the ability to perceive other worlds. In other words, modern man cannot know the location of other worlds because he has developed a mental block. The other worlds are still there, where they always were, but modern man is blocked from perceiving them by a change in his consciousness. Indeed, the other worlds can still be perceived, but only in altered states of consciousness that, to some extent, undo the recent changes of consciousness, and diminish our level of consciousness. Inner worlds no longer impose on men, that is why they are not perceived. To know inner worlds has become for modern men a matter of knowing, not perceiving. A matter, that is, of direct knowing. We should not strive to see through the blocks, nor to dissolve them away, because they are there for good reasons. Instead we can think over and around the blocks. In other words, final participation. Then we will know where are other worlds. And the answer is, in this same world. where they have always been. The reason for this change in consciousness is another matter, dealt with extensively elsewhere in this block. In a nutshell, the mental block has the positive function of increasing freedom, agency, by removing us from the former state of automatic/habitual, unavoidable and unconscious subjection to God's created reality. The mental block gives us the freedom positively to choose to align ourselves with divine creation. In other words, the block both imposes and gifts modern man with personal responsibility for his spiritual affiliation. How we make our luck, individually and socially. Bruce Charlton. Most of us are prone to lament our own bad luck, whether in terms of personal adversities, and/or the time and place we inhabit. A Christian who believes that God is good, as well as the Creator, ought to assume that overall, we get the luck we need. Yet it feels wrong to attribute to everything that happens to the will of God, because that would put us into a position of passivity, and God into the role of a manipulator rather than a teacher. So, on the one hand, in a created universe there is no such thing as luck, but on the other hand, in this reality made of beings in relationships, all purposes are not those of the Creator. We need to understand other ways by which life works. What follows is one of my favorite passages from the work of William Arkell, and one that has had a major influence on my thinking. Whenever I return to it, I find myself struck with renewed force at its discerning wisdom. Edited, by me, for brevity and clarity, from A Geography of Consciousness by William Arkell, 1974. It is accepted that if we cut off the leg of a live bird, the bird feels pain and distress. But we suppose that if we cut off the branch of a living tree, the tree neither feels anything nor is aware of anything. While it is accepted that the tree is a living thing, it is not considered a living creature. This is because the tree cannot communicate its distress to us. But the fact may be that we are simply incapable of receiving the tree's communications. Out of the thousands of such assumptions made about our natural background, many will be quite wrong and a lot more partly wrong. We have denied real intelligence to most of the animal world, but species like the dolphin are now found capable of a high degree of intelligence, playfulness and cooperation with man. This has not been recognized before, simply because we had not tried hard enough to develop communications with the dolphin. It has been too readily assumed that lack of communication implied lack of consciousness, but never in ourselves, always in what we failed to communicate with. While it is not suggested that we can talk to stones, there is some sort of communication which links us with everything. And if the structure of nature is conscious of us, even if we are not properly conscious of it, this structure will express its friendship, or hostility, and which will be based upon our attitude to the environment. Because we do not get the messages from the background, we avoid responsibility for failure to communicate. Therefore, when we suffer from savage storms, we assume that the savagery does not originate from ourselves but from nature. Either storms are meaningless and just happen, or, superstitiously, we fear that maybe some god is angry with us. We seldom consider the possibility that we ourselves have upset the structure of the natural background, of which we are an integral part, through the more intangible aspect of our personalities. The burden of all this is that a great deal of our luck may be caused by the reaction of our background to the quality or attitude of our own consciousness. As this is a collective phenomenon in most instances, we may find ourselves conditioned by unpleasant effects which are not the result of our wrong attitudes but of the attitudes of our fellow men. This sort of luck or background conditioning falls equally upon the deserving and the undeserving. In sum, this sort of luck is not luck at all, it is the result of our collective behavior. To put it into a few words, it is a rational proposition to say that if we lived more harmoniously with one another as well as with our background of natural phenomena, then this background would become more harmonious to us. Such a good outcome would not be caused by the intervention of God, but as a direct result of the unconscious effect our attitudes are in creating in the structures on which they impinge. This, I find a helpful perspective from which to consider the, partly self-willed, end of Western civilization, and its consequences. We may find ourselves interpreting much of what has happened, and, presumably, will happen in terms of our bad luck in living here and now, and with such evil rulers. But the fact is that while our attitudes and choices affect our own lives, they also affect others, otherwise they would be merely subjective. And the flip side of the power of our own good choices to benefit the collective situation is that we ourselves are inevitably part of the collective. Indeed, typically we are far more collective in our attitudes and choices than we recognize. As with such phenomena as RUP, residual unresolved positivism, or RU leftism. So when we ourselves become targets of environmentally destructive climate change politics, or anti-racism and the trans agenda, or, maybe soon, find ourselves embroiled in World War III, there are two aspects to the situation, inner and outer, individual and collective. Individually, it is usual that some of our own attitudes are supportive of exactly that which is being deplored. Typically, we support some principle, or institution, that, further down the line, leads to consequences we don't like. For instance, we act in ways that support agencies, charities, corporations, political groupings etc., who pursue net evil goals, harm human beings and the natural world, and encourage people to reject salvation and choose their own damnation. Therefore, collectively, we have, by our individual attitudes and habits, earned a share of the adversity that falls upon whole communities from economic collapse, totalitarianism, and war. This should not be understood as an excuse for fatalism, because we are, if we choose, individuals with a capacity for positive spiritual influence of a general nature, beyond ourselves, beyond our minds. But conversely, as part of the same setup, we are all somewhat responsible for evils of the collectives of which we are part. We can and should repent our complicity in evil, but repentance is not reform. We may know and reject evil, yet we cannot cease from doing evils, including to the non-human world of beings, whose agency and capacity for communication we typically deny. Therefore we should not be surprised when this living, conscious, purposive world of beings, who are as mixed in their nature and motivations as are we, try to tell us, communicating, sometimes, by various adverse occurrences, that they dislike what we are doing to them, that they react against us. Embrace the simple clear positive, eschew the complex double negative. Bruce Charlton. Christians do themselves, as well their cause, long-term harm by their habitual, addictive use of double negative theology. Indeed, there is a very influential branch of theology and Christian practice that has elaborated this into a vast systematic edifice, the negative path, or via negativa, plus, this is the basis of much Eastern religious philosophy in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sufism. I think we can see the collapse of double negative thinking in the 21st century, because its lack of simplicity and clarity render it incapable of dealing with the protean and pervasive challenges to faith of this era, as emanating from globalist totalitarianism with its linked bureaucracies of governance and mass media. Negative motivations are counterproductive, because when all is illusion then individuals are, in practice, rendered passively obedient to that which is dominant. And, anyway, the number and strength, and fluidity, of deceptions are now too great to be individually discerned, diagnosed and rejected. In a world where, for many or most people, it is a case of me against the world, my Christianity against a world of demonic materialist ideology, it seems we must be clear in our own minds, if we are not to be confused and bamboozled, and simply worn down to impotent exhaustion by the relentless and increasing weight of error and evil. For us, it is a case of motivation, motivation, motivation. Thus, we cannot anymore be motivated by such double negatives as the avoidance of sin. Most Christians who imagine this is possible are simply denying their own vast scale of sinning in domains such as dishonesty, resentment, and fear. Avoidance of sin is now effective, hence valid, only when there is a primary positive impulse towards good. But most people's idea of the good is some notion of altruism/unselfishness/helping others, which is another negative value. In a world based on utilitarian hedonism, where other people live materialistically, altruism reduces to me trying to make people happy, which is impossible, so it ends up with the negative goal of diminishing suffering. In practice, altruism at the political level entails a small class of super-powerful/super-privileged/super-rich individuals pretending to administer the world on behalf of the oppressed by monopolizing and confiscating all resources, supposedly because this globalist establishment are the agents of social justice. We cannot, if ever men could, be motivated by a desire for freedom, because freedom is a negative value that only gains motivating power for good, when there is some existing positive motivation towards good that is being thwarted. We cannot, if we intend to accomplish good, be motivated primarily by obedience to any external authority or institution, because all such are so corrupted that in practice goodness can only be discerned and practiced by the independent thinking of individual persons, and their autonomy of thinking. And that returns us to the primary of personal motivation. In other words, it is now imperative for Christian good both that individuals are motivated to think for themselves and do so, and that they operate from baseline assumptions that are positively motivating, which means simple and clear enough to be effective. In practice, each must discover these for himself. They are not available off the peg and will not be the values that get inculcated into the passively obedient or non-conscious, routine thinker. Since the problem is insufficient motivation, we need to begin from whatever positive and good motivations we already have, and follow these motivations through, with honesty and diligence too, wherever they will lead. The big problem is that so few people seem to have the motivation even to recognize a problem with the world now. This could, in theory, be because the world is now so pervasively and persuasively evil that modern men are helpless against its temptations. But that would be to assume God has failed to give men a reasonable chance of salvation. Alternatively, it may be that modern men are of innately poorer quality than men of the past, that a mass of men, especially in the West, are innately more dominated by evil, more prone to evil, and feebler in their strength of good motivations than before. I regard this worse men as the most probable explanation for a world full of men who do not even want to be good, but who instead legislate and enforce inverted true values, such that great evil is now called great good, and praised, rewarded and accorded the highest status. In other words, I assume that God is as good as ever, as powerful a creator as ever, but the quality of premortal souls available for incarnation into this mortal life is lower than in the past. A lot of incarnated souls nowadays are less naturally good / more heavily disposed towards evil, compared with the past. And therefore, here and now, all the major, large / powerful / wealthy / high status, human institutions of the hegemonic West, including churches, are net corrupted, are overall affiliated to the side of evil in the spiritual war of this world. Quite likely, you and I are similarly misaligned and enfeebled compared with men of the past, although I would not be writing, you would not be reading, this, unless there we had at least some motivation to be motivated for good. However, what worked for our ancestors may not work for us, since we are worse, and so is the world. We need things to be simpler, clearer and easier than they did, if we are to be able to develop and strengthen our embryonic good motivations into something positive by which we can navigate our path against the current of a hostile evil world of apparently overwhelming strength and scope. What is a man? What a woman? William Wildblood. I got into a conversation recently about transsexuals and whether a trans woman was a woman. When I said no, the two other participants seemed appalled at my opinion. It obviously marked me out as a bad or, at least, ignorant and bigoted person. I asked in what ways such a person, born male but supposedly made female by hormone treatment and surgery, a woman. I was told it was what she felt herself to be that mattered. In other words, the old feelings trump facts argument. I was told, and it may be true, I don't know, that in some people a female-oriented brain inhabits a male body and so they were clearly female from the beginning. But so what? I replied. They are in a male body so they are not female. I asked what they thought about the fact that a trans woman would not have a womb or 20 chromosomes as a biologically normal woman would have, but was told that was beside the point. Many biologically normal women cannot have children. Are they any less female? No, I said, but a biological woman whose biology is defective is quite different to a biological man who decides to be a woman. I asked if a white person decided he was black, did that mean he now was black? They avoided the question, but I failed to see how, in a rational universe, the two cases are different. Perhaps that is the issue here. We no longer live in a rational universe. I should say that I have the greatest sympathy for anyone who feels him or herself to be born in a body of the wrong sex. This must be a horrible position in which to find oneself. I realize there are medical anomalies, but genuine intrasexuals are rare. Most transsexuals are not like this. Moreover, that is not the point. The point is that a society that divorces itself from reality, for whatever reason, is a society that has separated itself from both God and nature, and it is therefore one that is on the way out. This is just the latest indication that we are such a society. When men's core motivations are defective. Bruce Charlton. The depth of the problem in current civilization is located at the most basic level of motivations, i.e., primarily in what people want, secondarily in how strongly they want it. There is a significant defect in the strength of motivations, which arises ultimately from the wrongness of motivations. We cannot be strongly motivated over time, by fake or feeble motivators. Potentially, and in the past, the strongest innate motivators for men are religious, and since religion has been excluded, or severely weakened, the remaining motivators are all labile, short-termist and selfish, for example sex, or the desire for any other pleasurable sensation. The short-termist and selfish desires of sex are not capable of being synthesized into any kind of coherent strategy for life, or the world, and the UN-repented effort to do so has led to the self-contradictory, self-defeating, negations of the evolving, devolving, sexual revolution, which began in propagating a hedonic free-for-all, and has becoming a bureaucratic, totalitarian minefield. In other words, people are trying and failing, over and again, to make a life and a philosophy of life, from the strongest motivators that remain to them after the spirit has been deleted, which are the evanescent, and zero-sum, pleasures of sex, travel, intoxication, status, power, resentment, fear, sadism and spite. Fleeting daydreams or nightmares of various kinds. But so long as the spiritual dimension is excluded, ignored or downgraded, persistent failure never leads to insight, learning and repentance, so Western man chases will-o'-the-wisps with all his energies, until dragged down by despair, disease, or death. Yet religious motivations are failing as well. They have, in the West, become so enfeebled that a large majority of the most devout churchgoers, of all types of church, including Christian, are indistinguishable from the godless masses when it comes to supporting the core evil agenda strategies. Even when religious people discern the proximate, in-your-face, evils of Western civ, such people fail to understand that these are the inevitable, baked-in, product of remote but primary ultimate causes that often enjoy their unthinking, habitual, or even passionate, support. Thus there is a double whammy of weak motivations, because the only valid motivators are long-term, cosmic in scope, and coherent. The usual response is to thrash around seeking immediate, socially approved and momentarily rewarding motivators from the content of modern culture, all of which are all evil and manipulative in origin, such that they are invariably temporary in effect, and leave people positioned in ever worse, ever more desperate, situations, drowning in tidal despair while grasping at, ever smaller and soggier, straws of optimism. Taking a step back and trying to understand more deeply the ultimate causes of this situation in order to find a strong and valid motivation for ourselves is now an absolute necessity, the alternative to which is spiritual death. In such a pervasively and overwhelmingly corrupt culture, this deeper and larger consideration absolutely must be done by individuals, done by each and every human being. This seems to be asking a lot of people, who have, through much of history, either followed their instincts, been given out a spirituality to live by, or had trusted sources of institutional guidance which they simply needed to obey. It may be asking a lot of people to go it alone in the quest of true motivation. It may seem unreasonable to require every single individual to do this for himself. But consider, who will benefit? The answer is that each individual will benefit from his own efforts, not merely temporarily in this mortal life, by the benefits of discovering and choosing a strong and lasting motivation from which this mortal life may be created, but also forever. And this is something that, exactly because only we can accomplish it, our loving God has therefore made possible for anyone to accomplish, if only they make the serious attempt. How much more incentive do we need? Temptations in responding to the oppressions of here and now evil. Bruce Charlton. One major strategy of purposive evil, here and now, in the West and globally, is to oppress people with so much actual and prospective evil that people will give up and yield, go crazy, or try to fight evil with evil. This decades-long strategic plan is one of crushing all that is good by sheer weight of evil discourse, has been made possible by the totalitarian takeover of the system, the web of linked bureaucracies that control all major institutions including mass media, politics, public administration, law, religion, science, education, health, etc. Spiritually, the strategy is to make us frame the world as, on the one hand, a vast, inexorable, objective, all-embracing organization that orders everything and does everything. And, on the other hand, you or me, standing alone and isolated, friendless and hated, worthless and expendable, stupidly and pathetically thinking about resisting the inevitable. The idea is that we should surrender, fawn, and, in our hearts, beg the system for mercy. In return, we shall eagerly believe /think /say /do anything that they currently require of us, and enforce the system on ourselves and each other. And, eventually, after getting ever less and less in return for ever more and more self-degradation and lying, that we should break, despair, lose hope, and seek permanent oblivion, death as annihilation, to escape such a spiritual wasteland and hell. A second level of the plan is to channel resistance to evil, such that it is either counterproductive or futile. There are several temptations. One temptation is to withdraw from evil, to escape it. While this may be an important, or even, vital temporary tactic, the fact is that evil cannot be escaped in this world, where it is all pervasive as never before. Further, the attempt to escape may open the mind to evil-inspired fantasies and to dreams. Furthermore, the desire to escape evil is a double negative that is not itself good, and is, indeed, prone to being manipulated into evil. To clarify, resistance to evil is not itself good. Good can be accomplished only by striving for positive good. The spirit we should instead cultivate is one in which we become aware of our own good heart and rooted in a commitment to love, that is, we may become consciously connected with, rooted in, the divine within us which each person has as a consequence of being a son or daughter of God. This is quite simple, and experienced as obvious, once we ask the right questions of ourselves and the world, and correctly understand our situation and role. Naturally, the powers of evil has many tactics for undermining the confidence of someone who is rooted in a correct understanding of himself and his proper role. His attitudes may be undermined so he loses confidence, or else inflated so that his confidence extends from its true and proper sphere towards prideful and false assertion of self-importance. It can be made to sound like an impossible balancing act to steer between the dangers of inflation and submission, that is, itself, another demonic strategy, to make life seem impossibly difficult, so we may as well give up now. But, part of having the right attitude is to know that this is a false analogy. We are not steering a course through hazards, but are beings with a divine core self, who are living with the benefit of both inner and outer guidance, intuition and the Holy Ghost. And who have the inestimable advantage of being able to err and sin, and then, as soon as we become aware of the fact, an unbounded capacity to repent and realign with God's creative will. To be perfectly accurate, we have nothing to worry about. And if we aren't, deep down, and in our hearts, replete with carefree joy and supreme confidence, then we must be living in a state of error. The demons can increase the weight of oppression incrementally, piling problems on, but we can never be crushed by it. Unless we thus choose. We cannot win at this business of life, but it is a colossal error to suppose that we are supposed to win. We are supposed to learn from living, not to win a prize for it. The prize, i.e. eternal, resurrected, heavenly life, comes after this life and by following Jesus, and not as a consequence of any accomplishment during this life. But the magnitude and scope of this prize increases in value whenever we live by love, and whenever we think, or otherwise create, in harmony with divine creation. Such choices come to us, even if unsought, and we can always do/choose the right thing, so we should face life confidently, that is, with confidence in the primacy of the Spirit, and the indomitable triumph of the divine. The reality of the spiritual world. William Wildblood. Below is an extract, very slightly edited, from my second book Remember the Creator, see right. It deals with the spiritual beings who spoke to me over a period of 20 years and who are mentioned in the title of this blog. If there is one thing I would like to get across in my writing here, it would be the reality of the spiritual world, and of the beings who dwell in it. These are the just men made perfect. They exist and are real and work so that we may join their company. Have every confidence in that simple but inspiring truth. I am writing this now because we are in this world currently surrounded by evil on an unprecedented scale. Most people would think that a ridiculous thing to say. Aren't we better off than before, with less inequality, more justice, less violence, more tolerance? Quite frankly, so what if we have traded that for our souls, and we have? There is more spiritual evil, as in denial of spiritual reality, than there ever has been, and so I would like to draw attention to spiritual reality as it is expressed in the form of just men made perfect. In my book Meeting the Masters, I tried to describe the nature of the spiritual beings who spoke to me. I wish I could do them justice, but my powers of description fall short. They inspired both love and respect, even a certain amount of awe, in me, and I don't consider myself as someone easily impressed. Over the course of my life I have met all sorts of people, but none of them could hold a candle to the Masters. Michael Lord, their medium, who had led a very sophisticated life mingling with aristocracy and political leaders on the one hand, and film stars and celebrities on the other, said the same thing. He did not speak to them as I did, naturally, since he was their medium, but they communicated with him clairaudiently, and he told me he sometimes saw faces of great beauty and dignity. He had met people from Winston Churchill to Mahatma Gandhi and all sorts and conditions of men and women in between, including monks, abbots, sannyasis and swamis. No one, he said, could begin to compare to the masters. This was not because of anything as mundane as charisma or force of personality, star quality. Michael had met plenty of people like that and knew it was usually a fairly superficial thing. No, it was to do with spiritual presence, an aura, for want of a better word, of love and wisdom that imposed by its certainty and depth rather than a feeling of power or excitement. Power there was in plenty, but it was the power of truth, not personality, and it was accompanied by a sense of peace like no other. I am not comparing the masters with Christ, though I do think of them as something like his disciples, but I was often reminded of the words from the Gospel of St. John when they spoke. My peace I give unto you. Sometimes they used almost the exact same words, usually on departure when they blessed me, and the peace they bestowed during and after a visit was an almost tangible thing. For a while at least, until the afterglow of their presence faded and I was back in the everyday world. I think their words, as reported in the book from notes I took at the time, alas, I only did so for the first year, convey something of their quality. But they don't give a feel of their presence which taught as much as the words they spoke. To me they seemed of another world, but not in the sense of being inhuman. They were very human, but had all the virtues of the ideal man with none of the shortcomings of the mortal version. They had developed in themselves all the spiritual qualities, love, wisdom and so on, but had these in a real and inbuilt sense, not in the rather self-conscious way one often encounters them in spiritual circles. It was how they were, as natural to them as thought and emotion are to us. They radiated a feeling of total authenticity, and also a nobility that imposed by its authority and absolute truthfulness. But they never enforced this. The difference between these spiritual beings and any person in this world striving to be spiritual, even the best of us, is profound. I have said the masters were very human, and so they were, but they were also much more than human. They came from another place, one in which the possibility of sin or falseness was entirely absent, and where love was the dominant mode of being, a pure and holy love bearing little resemblance to our rather crude, often tainted by ego, versions of it. They walked in the light of God, and felt and thought in a way that was completely centered in the reality of God. For them God was a constant presence and a fact from which everything else derived. I have been asked how many of them spoke to me. The truth is I don't exactly know. The answer is several, and I could usually tell one from another, but no names were given except once when one of the higher masters spoke to me. That was how he was introduced by another master who had spoken to me earlier in the session. He had an air of such regality that I felt, even more than usual, that I had better be on my best behavior. I must repeat that this was neither asked nor expected of me. It was simply the natural authority of their presence that prompted such a reaction in me. The higher masters did not speak to me often, but I mention them to make the point that even in heaven there is hierarchy. And why would there not be? If spiritual evolution, as in unfoldment of pre-existing potential similar to the development from seed to tree, is endless, and I think it is, that is only to be expected. This, by the way, is a crucial difference between theistic and non-theistic forms of religion or mysticism. When you reach enlightenment or realization in the latter, that's more or less it. You have reached the absolute, and where is there to go after that, especially if there is no I to go anywhere? But a theistic system in which the one and the many both exist has the possibility of there being endless vistas of reality, deeper and deeper truths as you enter ever more completely into the heart of God and the fullness of truth. And God has no top nor bottom nor beginning nor end to him at all. I have also been asked why, given such beings as masters exist, they do not communicate with more people more frequently, but this is to misunderstand their purpose. The masters are spiritual teachers in the purest sense, and that is why they do not teach through words, which are concrete things that may obscure as much as they convey, so much as through influence. Their aim is to make their disciples receptive to the spiritual plane of being, not the idea of the spiritual plane, and their primary focus is on awakening the intuition. This they do by stimulating the so-called higher bodies and then encouraging the disciple to, metaphorically speaking, stretch upwards beyond the everyday mind, through meditation, aspiration, self-forgetfulness, prayer and the like, and thereby become more attuned to the soul. There are plenty of teachers in this world to do the still important but more preliminary work of reorienting those focused in their earthly selves to the soul, but the work of the masters lies with those who are already conscious of the soul as the dominating force in their lives but have not as yet become fully one with it. That is why they work predominantly on higher, supersensory levels. You can get an idea of their teaching methods by considering their own words. Obey the impressions we fill you with and be true to yourself. The more you respond to impression, the stronger it will become. Note their choice of words as well as what they say. They use the word obey. Obedience goes against the grain for the modern person as it appears to challenge our personal autonomy, and we are very self-centered people. We are individuals and we demand our freedom. But we are not free. We are slaves to the ego with its self-will, opinions and desires. Spirituality requires surrender and submission to the higher authorities, by which I mean truth and our own soul. It requires obedience. Here's a novel definition of a master for you. It is one who is perfectly obedient. Obedience makes us free. Christianity and self-gratification, is it a guide to goodness, or an evil manipulation? Bruce Charlton. I was always struck by C.S. Lewis's hardline attitude to happiness or self-gratification in relation to Christianity, the way he emphasized the problem of mixing up the therapeutic aspect of belief with the business of what is actually true. In the Screwtape Letters and Great Divorce, as well as his more abstractly theological works, Lewis negatively depicted people who fluently excused whatever they wanted to do, what they currently enjoyed doing, or what made them feel better, by making arguments that linked these to Christianity. In the Narnia Chronicles, this was encapsulated in the phrase stating that Aslan, i.e. Jesus, is not a tame lion. That is to say, Christianity cannot be comfortably domesticated and stay Christian. Certainly it is a real problem, but, especially in The Last Battle, Lewis also depicted the opposite problem, which happens when the cruelty and destructiveness of the evil demon Tash is explained as being the actions of Aslan, or later, the oxymoronic false invention Tashlan, syncretized from both good and evil deities. These actual evils, in reality motivated by greed, selfishness and sadism, were effectively propagandized as consistent with the fact that Aslan is not a tame lion. And therefore the fact that God is not aiming at our immediate self-gratification is twisted into a mask for the devil. In other words, on the one hand it is true that, at a superficial level of here and now, the goodness of God may be experienced as harsh life lessons that are, nonetheless, necessary for our ultimate and eternal benefit. Yet, on the other hand, to know when this is actually the case, and when evil outcomes are instead a product of evil intent, requires honest discernment as to the motivations. So, the experienced and observed miseries and sufferings of this world are not evidence in either direction. They might be necessary and temporary means to a good end, or they might be the end in itself. Cruelty, destruction, misery, suffering might be the actual purpose of evil beings. The correct answer must come from discernment, and the discernment, while taking account of evidence, cannot derive from evidence. As always, we are driven down to an acknowledgement that all knowledge depends on intuition, an individual act of an individual being. And, further, that Christian discernment entails acknowledgement that there is a side of good, i.e. God, and a side of evil, i.e. the demons. We first need to know this in order to choose one or the other side, and only by choosing a side can be, even in principle, make a discernment as to whether a particular event was motivated by good or evil intent. For a Christian, to deny that good and evil are separate and opposite sides, amounts to the false deity of Tashlan, in other words, to base discernment on an assumption of unity, oneness. Non-dualism is itself merely a type of evil. From this analysis we can see that Christianity is related to self-gratification, i.e. the pleasurable, comfortable, desirable, in that God wants us to be deeply and eternally happy, but such a goal entails that we must sometimes be temporarily and superficially miserable. To know what is going on in the here and now we need to depend on divine guidance, which, because God is the Creator, is good, and is our loving parent/s, we have all been equipped with. We all have potentially available both direct access, i.e. in our stream of thinking, to true inner guidance, because we have within us something of the divine, being children of God. And this inner guidance also enables us to have access indirectly to external guidance, both directly from the Holy Ghost, and indirectly from all other sources of information such as legitimate and wise authority, for example of men and books, true tradition, and any other cultural product. In sum, deep self-gratification is a sure guide to the operations of God and His agents, while superficial self-gratification may be a consequence of the manipulations, or sadism, of evil men and or the beings of supernatural evil.